In the fog-shrouded marshlands of northern Poland, 34 kilometers east of the ancient city of Danzig, stood a place that would become synonymous with unimaginable suffering. Here, among the wetlands and dense forests, the Nazis established what would become their first concentration camp on foreign soil. This was Stutthof, a name that would echo through history as one of the most brutal facilities in the entire Nazi camp system. But what made Stutthof truly unique was not just its location or its longevity. It was the systematic brutalization of women that occurred within its barbed wire perimeter. When we think of Nazi concentration camps, images of Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen often come to mind. Yet Stutthof operated in the shadows, far from the public eye, carrying out atrocities that shocked even hardened SS officers. This remote facility would become home to over 100,000 prisoners during its nearly 6 years of operation, with women comprising the vast majority of its victims in the final, most horrific phase of its existence. What unfolded behind those electrified fences defied comprehension. Female guards, some barely out of their teens, transformed into instruments of terror. Prisoners were subjected to medical experiments that belonged in the darkest corners of human imagination. And when the end came, thousands of women were marched into the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea and machine-gunned down in what became known as the most brutal evacuation in concentration camp history. Today, we're going to explore the complete story of Stutthof, from its origins as a detention facility for Polish intellectuals to its transformation into a killing machine specifically designed to terrorize women. We'll examine the lives of both the perpetrators and victims, uncover the systematic cruelty that defined daily existence within the camp, and witness the final desperate acts of violence as Nazi Germany collapsed around its creators. This is not just another story about Nazi brutality. This is the story of a place where the darkest impulses of human nature were given free rein, where young women became willing participants in genocide, and where the very concept of mercy was systematically eradicated. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Holocaust and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. The story begins on September 2nd, 1939. Just one day after Germany's invasion of Poland. As Wehrmacht forces swept across the Polish border, SS units were already implementing plans for what they euphemistically call the pacification of the occupied territories. In the marshy forests near the village of Stutthof, work crews began constructing what would initially serve as a civilian internment camp for Polish political prisoners and intellectuals. The location was chosen with calculated precision. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, with the Vistula River to the west, Vistula Bay to the east, and the Baltic Sea to the north, escape would be virtually impossible. The marshy terrain made the ground unstable and difficult to traverse, while the dense forests provided natural camouflage for the activities that would soon take place within the camp's boundaries. Heinrich Himmler himself had ordered the establishment of this facility as part of his broader plan to eliminate Polish leadership and intelligentsia. The goal was simple yet horrifying: decapitate Polish society by removing its educated elite, leaving behind a population suitable only for slave labor. In a chilling directive, Himmler wrote that the Polish nation was to be reduced to a leaderless, laboring mass, incapable of resistance or independent thought. The first prisoners arrived within weeks of the camp's establishment. University professors, priests, lawyers, teachers, and local government officials were rounded up in mass arrests across the region. These men and women represented the intellectual backbone of Polish society, and their systematic removal was designed to ensure that Poland would never again function as an independent nation. Initially, conditions at Stutthof were harsh but not yet genocidal. Prisoners faced overcrowding, inadequate food, and brutal work details. But the camp had not yet evolved into the killing machine it would later become. The early commandants, while cruel, were still operating under the pretense that this was a legitimate detention facility for enemy combatants and political prisoners. However, This relatively restrained phase would not last long. As the war expanded and Nazi racial ideology became more radical, Stutthof began to transform. In January 1942, the facility was officially redesignated as a concentration camp, bringing it under the direct control of the SS concentration camp system. This administrative change marked the beginning of a new and far more sinister chapter in the camp's history. The transformation accelerated dramatically in 1944, as Soviet forces began their westward advance. Faced with the prospect of losing territory in the Baltic states and eastern Poland, Nazi authorities made the fateful decision to evacuate Jewish populations from ghettos and camps in the path of the Soviet advance. Stutthof, with its remote location and existing infrastructure, became the destination for these massive forced relocations. Between July and December of 1944, over 48,000 Jewish prisoners, the vast majority of them women, were transported to Stutthof from camps and ghettos across the Baltic region. This influx transformed the camp from a relatively small facility housing around 7,000 prisoners to a massive complex holding nearly 50,000 inmates by the end of the year. The arrival of these Jewish women fundamentally changed the character of Stutthof. What had been primarily a political prison became something far more sinister, a facility specifically designed for the systematic brutalization and murder of women. The camp was rapidly expanded with new barracks, additional sub-camps, and most ominously, a gas chamber designed specifically for the mass killing of prisoners deemed too weak or sick to work. To manage this massive influx of female prisoners, the SS recruited hundreds of German women to serve as guards. These Aufseherinnen, as they were known, came from all walks of life. Some were former factory workers seeking better pay and status. Others were young women looking for adventure or escape from traditional domestic roles. Many were simply opportunists who saw a chance to wield power over others with complete impunity. What happened next defied all expectations. Rather than showing compassion or solidarity with their fellow women, many of these female guards embraced their roles with enthusiasm that shocked even their male colleagues. They developed innovative methods of torture, participated eagerly in selections for the gas chambers, and competed with each other to demonstrate their cruelty and dedication to Nazi ideology. Among these guards, certain names would become synonymous with extraordinary brutality. Jenny Wanda Barkman, a former model from Hamburg, earned the nickname the Beautiful Spectre for her combination of striking appearance and sadistic cruelty. Elizabeth Becker became known for her practice of selecting children for the gas chambers with particular enthusiasm. Gerda Steinhoff developed a reputation for beating prisoners to death with her bare hands. These women were not aberrations or exceptions. They represented a systematic recruitment and training program designed to create female perpetrators capable of carrying out genocide. The SS had discovered that women could be just as effective as men in implementing the final solution, and in some cases, even more so. Female guards could access areas of the camp where male guards were prohibited, could search female prisoners more thoroughly, and could exploit the trust and vulnerability that women prisoners might feel toward other women. The daily routine that emerged at Stutthof during this period was designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the pretense of productive labor. Prisoners were awakened before dawn for roll call that could last for hours in all weather conditions. Those too weak to stand were beaten or sent directly to the gas chamber. The fortunate ones were assigned to work details that ranged from construction projects to sorting the belongings of murdered prisoners. The work assignments themselves became instruments of torture. Women were forced to carry heavy stones across the marshy terrain, often sinking knee-deep into the mud with their burdens. Others were assigned to the camp's expanding construction projects, hauling lumber and cement in conditions that would have challenged healthy men, let alone malnourished women weakened by months of starvation and abuse. The most dreaded assignment was selection for the medical experimentation block. Here, German physicians conducted sterilization experiments on Jewish and Roma women, testing various methods of mass sterilization that could be implemented across occupied Europe. Dr. Rudolf Spanner, the camp's chief medical officer, became particularly notorious for his experiments involving the injection of caustic substances directly into women's reproductive organs. Survivors later testified that the screams from the medical block could be heard across the entire camp, a constant reminder of the horrors that awaited those deemed suitable for experimentation. Perhaps most disturbing was how the female guards embraced their roles in these atrocities. Jenny Wanda Barkman would personally escort women to the gas chambers, often selecting victims based on arbitrary criteria such as their appearance or perceived attitude. Witnesses described how she would stand at the entrance to the gas chamber, smiling as she directed terrified women and children inside. When questioned about her methods during her later trial, Barkman showed no remorse, instead laughing at the accusations and declaring that life was a pleasure meant to be enjoyed. The winter of 1944 brought a typhus epidemic that swept through the overcrowded barracks like wildfire. With prisoners packed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number, disease spread rapidly through the population. The camp's hospital became a charnel house where the sick were left to die without medical attention. One survivor described entering the women's hospital barrack to find rows of naked women lying on the floor, each forced to rest her head on the legs of the woman beside her to conserve space. Many were already dead, their bodies remaining among the living for days before removal. Rather than addressing the humanitarian crisis, the camp administration saw the epidemic as an opportunity to accelerate the killing process. Guards would conduct daily selections in the hospital barracks, identifying those deemed too weak to recover and sending them directly to the gas chamber. The criteria for selection became increasingly arbitrary, with some women condemned to death simply for appearing tired or dejected. Elizabeth Becker gained particular notoriety during this period for her enthusiasm in conducting these medical selections. Survivors testified that she would enter the hospital barracks with a riding crop, using it to lift the faces of sick women and determine their fate with a casual gesture. Those who could not sit up straight when commanded were immediately marked for death. Becker reportedly told other guards that she was performing a mercy by ending the suffering of these women, though witnesses noted that she seemed to take particular pleasure in her role as judge and executioner. The system of collective punishment ensured that terror permeated every aspect of camp life. When one woman attempted to escape, entire barracks would be deprived of food for days. When contraband was discovered, random selections would be made for execution as an example to others. The guards cultivated an atmosphere where prisoners could never feel safe, where any moment might bring arbitrary violence or death. Gerda Steinhoff became infamous for her practice of conducting surprise inspections of prisoner barracks in the middle of the night. She would arrive with a group of guards, force all occupants to stand naked in the cold while their meager possessions were searched, and then select random individuals for beatings or worse punishments. These midnight raids served no practical purpose beyond terrorizing the prisoners and demonstrating the absolute power that the guards wielded over their victims. As Soviet forces drew closer to the camp in late 1944, the pace of killing accelerated dramatically. The gas chamber, which had operated sporadically throughout the year, began working around the clock. Trainloads of prisoners who had just arrived from evacuated camps in the east were sent directly from the railway platform to the gas chamber without even entering the main camp. The SS had abandoned any pretense that Stutthof was a labor camp. It had become purely an extermination facility. The arrival of winter brought new horrors as the camp's infrastructure collapsed under the strain of overcrowding and neglect. Heating fuel became scarce, and many barracks received no heat at all during the coldest months. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, but even this small comfort was often denied when guards would force them to stand outside in freezing temperatures for extended roll calls or punishments. Food rations, already inadequate, were reduced further as supply lines became disrupted by the advancing Soviet forces. The daily bread ration shrank to barely 100 grams per person, supplemented only by thin soup made from potato peels and scraps. Prisoners began dying of starvation at an accelerated rate, their bodies simply unable to sustain life on such meager provisions. The female guards showed no mercy, even as the situation became increasingly desperate. If anything, they seemed to intensify their cruelty as the end approached. Jenny Wanda Barkman was observed forcing starving prisoners to perform calisthenics in the snow, beating those who collapsed from exhaustion. When asked by a fellow guard why she continued such practices when the war was clearly lost, Barkman reportedly replied that she intended to enjoy her power while it lasted. By January 1945, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance, Camp Commandant Paul Werner Hoppe received orders to begin the evacuation of Stutthof. What followed would become one of the most horrific episodes in the entire history of the concentration camp system. Rather than simply abandoning the camp or surrendering to advancing Soviet forces, the SS decided to eliminate as many prisoners as possible before retreating. The first phase of this final solution began on January 25th, when approximately 5,000 prisoners from Stutthof's subcamps were marched to the shores of the Baltic Sea. There, in temperatures well below freezing, they were forced into the icy waters and machine-gunned by SS guards positioned on the beach. Those who attempted to swim to safety were picked off by marksmen, while others simply froze to death in the water. Local fishermen later reported that bodies continued washing ashore for weeks after the massacre. The main camp evacuation began in earnest during the final weeks of January. Columns of prisoners, primarily women, were forced to march westward through the frozen Polish countryside with minimal clothing and no food provisions. The guards had been instructed to shoot anyone who fell behind or attempted to escape. The death marches from Stutthof would claim more lives than all the previous months of systematic killing combined. One survivor described the march as a journey through hell, with bodies littering the roadside every few hundred meters. Women who had somehow survived months or years of imprisonment were now dying within hours of beginning the march. The guards showed no consideration for the weather conditions or the prisoners' weakened state, maintaining a pace that ensured only the strongest would survive. Jenny Wanda Barkman volunteered to accompany one of these death marches, reportedly telling her colleagues that she wanted to see the operation through to its conclusion. Witnesses described her riding alongside the column on horseback, using her riding crop to beat prisoners who moved too slowly. When the march was halted by advancing Soviet forces, she was among the guards who attempted to massacre the remaining prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. The final act of this tragedy came in March and April of 1945, when the remaining prisoners were evacuated by sea. Packed into overcrowded vessels with no provisions for food, water, or sanitation, hundreds more died during the voyage. When some ships reached the German coast, prisoners who were too weak to disembark were simply thrown overboard. Others were forced into the water at gunpoint and shot as they attempted to swim to shore. Soviet forces finally liberated Stutthof on May 9, 1945, finding fewer than 100 prisoners who had managed to hide during the final evacuation. The camp that had once held nearly 50,000 people was virtually empty, its barracks burned and its records destroyed. The magnitude of what had occurred there would only become clear during the post-war investigations and trials. The story of Stutthof stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience. In the ashes of this place of horror, we find not just evidence of evil, but also proof of the human spirit's ability to endure and bear witness. The women who suffered here, both as prisoners and as perpetrators, remind us that the boundaries between civilization and barbarism are far more fragile than we might wish to believe. Their stories demand that we remember, that we learn, and that we remain vigilant against the forces that could create another Stutthof in our own time.